It was supposed to be just another conversation, a quiet exchange about life, art, and meaning. But when Joe Rogan leaned forward and asked Keanu Reeves one simple question, the air shifted. Keanu smiled faintly, then fell silent. Something inside him cracked open, and what he said next would leave Joe and the entire world completely unprepared. And before we continue, tell us what's your favorite Keanu Reeves movie of all time. Let us know in the comments. The familiar red glow of the recording. Light illuminates the Austin studio as Joe Rogan settles into his chair across from one of Hollywood's most enigmatic figures. Keanu Reeves sits comfortably in the guest chair, wearing his characteristic simple black t-shirt and jeans, his graying hair falling naturally around his shoulders to millions of podcast listeners. This appears to be just another episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, a casual conversation between two men who've built their careers on being authentic in an industry known for artifice, but today feels different. There's an energy in the air that both men can sense, but neither can quite identify. Joe adjusts his headphones and glances at his notes. Standard questions about upcoming films, training regimens, philosophical musings that have made Keanu a beloved internet figure. What Joe doesn't know is that he's about to ask a question that will crack open something Keanu has kept buried for decades. So Joe begins, his voice carrying that familiar conversational tone that has made him one of the world's most trusted interviewers. Everyone knows you've been through some incredibly difficult times, loss, tragedy, setbacks that would break most people. But you always seem to come through it with this incredible grace and resilience. Keanu nods, his expression neutral but attentive. He's heard variations of this observation countless times over the years. Journalists, talk show hosts, and podcasters all fascinated by his ability to maintain humility and kindness, despite the cruel blows life has dealt him. Here's what I'm curious about. Joe continues, leaning forward slightly in that way he does when he's genuinely interested in an answer. With everything you've been through, the loss of your daughter, your best friend, River Phoenix dying, your father abandoning the family when you were young, how do you keep going? What gets you up in the morning when everything feels hopeless? It's a question Joe has asked variations of before, to soldiers returning from war, to comedians battling depression, to athletes overcoming career-ending injuries. He expects a thoughtful response about perseverance, maybe a mention of meditation or finding purpose in work. What he doesn't expect is the way Keanu's entire posture shifts, the way his hand still on his knees, the way something behind his eyes seems to shutter closed. The studio falls into a silence that stretches beyond the comfortable pause of someone gathering their thoughts. This is different. This is the silence of someone who has just been asked to excavate something buried so deep that even acknowledging its existence feels dangerous. Joe notices the change immediately after. Thousands of interviews he's developed an instinct for when a conversation has hit something real, something raw. He can see Keanu processing the question, weighing whether to give his standard response about gratitude and perspective, or whether to travel into territory he's never explored publicly. That's Keanu begins, then stops. He looks down at his hands, then back at Joe, then away toward the studio wall where motivational posters and fight memorabilia create a backdrop that suddenly feels incongruent with the weight of the moment. "I'm sorry," Keanu says, his voice softer than it's been throughout their conversation. "That's actually a really difficult question for me to answer." Joe's expression shifts from casual curiosity to gentle concern. In all his years of podcasting, through conversations with broken fighters and traumatized veterans, he's learned to recognize when someone is standing at the edge of something significant. "We don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," Joe offers, but there's something in his tone that suggests he senses they're on the verge of something important. Keanu shakes his head slowly. "No, it's actually a question I think about every day. I just don't think I've ever been asked it so directly." Before the admission hangs in the air between them, both men can feel that they've moved beyond the realm of typical celebrity interview into something more intimate, more dangerous. Joe's audience expects entertainment, insight, maybe some behind-the-scenes stories from movie sets. What they're about to get is something far more profound and disturbing. The truth is, Keanu says, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "There have been times when I didn't know how to keep going, times when getting up in the morning felt like an impossible task." Joe nods encouragingly, understanding that he's witnessing someone prepare to share something they've never shared before. And there was one particular moment. Keanu continues, "One specific day when I almost didn't, when I came closer than I've ever admitted to just stopping." The studio seems to contract around them, the casual podcast atmosphere transforming into something more like a confessional. Joe can sense that Keanu is approaching a revelation that will change how people understand him, how they understand resilience, how they understand the thin line between surviving and surrendering. But as Keanu takes a deep breath and prepares to continue his story, neither man realizes that what's about to be shared will do more than just move their audience to tears. It will challenge everything people believe about strength, vulnerability, and what it really means to be human in a world that often feels designed to break us. Yet something in Keanu's expression suggests that this story won't just be about darkness and despair. There's a flicker of something else there, hope maybe, or gratitude. But first, he'll have to take his listeners through the valley of shadows to get to whatever light waits on the other side. And Joe Rogan, master of difficult conversations, is about to guide him through the most difficult conversation of his life. It was 2005. Keanu begins, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone that suggests he's accessing memories he'd rather leave buried. "I was 41 years old, and from the outside, everything looked like it was going well. The Matrix trilogy had been completed. I was financially secure. I had projects lined up. But inside," he pauses, and Joe can see him struggling with how much to reveal, how deep to go into waters he's never navigated publicly. Inside, "I was drowning." The simple statement lands with unexpected force. Joe has interviewed hundreds of people who've described depression, addiction, and trauma. But there's something about Keanu's delivery, the quiet certainty of it, that makes the words hit differently. The thing about grief, Keanu continues, is that it doesn't follow any schedule. People expect you to get over things, to move through the stages and emerge healed on the other side. But some losses carve out parts of you that never grow back. Joe nods, recognizing the truth in those words. "You're talking about Ava." "I'm talking about all of it," Keanu responds, his voice gaining a slight edge. "Ava River, my father leaving when I was 3, but also smaller things that people don't know about, the daily accumulation of disappointment and loneliness that builds up over years until it becomes this weight." The way he describes it, not as dramatic episodes, but as an accumulation, speaks to something many people recognize but rarely hear articulated so clearly. "I remember sitting in my house one evening." Keanu says, his eyes unfocused as he accesses the memory. "It was a Tuesday in October. No, it was Tuesday because I remember thinking about how empty the week stretched ahead of me. No filming, no commitments, just days to fill." Joe leans forward slightly, sensing that they're approaching something significant. I had been sitting in the same chair for probably 6 hours, Keanu continues. Hadn't eaten, hadn't answered my phone, hadn't even moved except to occasionally look out the window at the street, where normal people were living normal lives. The image he's painting is one of complete disconnection, not just from others but from life itself. And that's when it occurred to me, Keanu says, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that no one would notice if I just stopped, that I could disappear from the world and it would continue spinning exactly as it had before. Joe's expression shows that he understands they've moved far beyond casual conversation about resilience. This is someone describing the edge of something much darker. I started thinking about it practically. Keanu admits, and there's something chilling about the calm way he describes this. Who would find me? How long it would take? What the headlines would say? It wasn't emotional thinking. It was just logistical. The clinical nature of his description makes it somehow more disturbing than if he'd described emotional breakdown or dramatic despair. That should have been a warning sign, Keanu says with a bitter smile. When ending your life starts to feel like just another problem to solve efficiently. Joe has interviewed special forces soldiers, extreme athletes, people who face death in various forms, but there's something about hearing Keanu Reeves, beloved by millions for his kindness and humility, describe suicidal ideation with such matter-of-fact precision that hits differently. Did anyone know? Joe asks, gently. Were you reaching out to friends, family, therapists? Keanu shakes his head. That's the thing about that particular kind of darkness. It convinces you that you're a burden, that reaching out would just be inflicting your problems on people who have their own lives to live. The isolation he's describing is complete, not just physical, but psychological and emotional. I had convinced myself that I was being considerate. Keanu continues, by handling this problem myself, by not dragging anyone else into my mess. So what happened? Joe asks, though something in his tone suggests he's almost afraid to hear the answer. I made a plan, Keanu says simply. Nothing dramatic or attention-seeking, just practical arrangements for when I was gone. The matter-of-fact way he discusses this is perhaps the most disturbing element of his revelation. This wasn't a cry for help or a moment of emotional breakdown. This was someone systematically preparing to end their life. I wrote letters, Keanu admits, to my mother, my sister, a few close friends. Not suicide notes exactly, but goodbye letters, thank you notes. Explanations that weren't really explanations. Joe's face shows the weight of what he's hearing. His usual role as curious interviewer has shifted into something more like witness to a confession. I remember feeling relief as I wrote them, Keanu says. And this detail is perhaps the most chilling of all relief, that soon I wouldn't have to pretend to be okay anymore, wouldn't have to carry this weight, wouldn't have to figure out how to get through another day. The studio has become completely still. Even the usual background hum of equipment seems muted, as if the recording apparatus itself is holding its breath. And then Keanu says, his voice changing, slightly gaining something that might be wonder or gratitude. Something happened that changed everything. Joe waits, understanding instinctively that this is where the story pivots, where whatever light exists in this narrative will begin to emerge. But as Keanu prepares to reveal what happened next, what intervention or realization or accident of fate pulled him back from the edge, it's clear that the journey to that moment of salvation will require going even deeper into the darkness first, because sometimes before you can appreciate the light you have, to fully understand just how close you came to losing it forever. What Keanu shares next will not just be about his own near miss with mortality, but about the unexpected ways Grace Keanu When you least expect it and most need it. The night I planned to do it, Keanu continues, his voice now carrying the weight of someone who has never spoken these words aloud before. I had everything arranged. Letters, written affairs in order, even specific instructions for my assistant about how to handle things afterward. Joe's hands are still on the table between them, his usual animated gesturing completely absent as he processes the gravity of what he's hearing. I remember the strange calm that came over me. Keanu says his eyes focused on something far beyond the studio walls for weeks. I had been carrying this crushing weight, this constant sense of drowning. But once he made the decision, once I had a plan, there was this peace. The way he describes this psychological state is terrifying in its clarity. This isn't someone describing a moment of emotional crisis, but rather a methodical preparation for self-destruction. I had chosen a Friday night. Keanu admits I figured it would give people the weekend to process the news before having to return to work on Monday. Even in planning my own death, I was trying to be considerate of other people's schedules. The detail reveals something profound about Keanu's psychology. Even in his darkest moment, his concern for others' well-being persisting even as he planned to end his own life. I spent that Friday doing normal things. He continues, I went for a walk. I read for a while. Even watched a movie. It was like I was saying goodbye to these simple pleasures without anyone knowing that's what I was doing. Joe can see the profound sadness in Keanu's expression as he recalls this day, but also something else, a kind of wonder at his own survival, as if he's describing events from someone else's life around 1000 p.m. I took a shower and put in clean or clothes. I remember thinking about how I wanted to be found. How strange is that even in that moment, I was worried about making things easier for whoever would have to deal with the aftermath. The consideration for others even in such a moment speaks to something essential about Keanu's character that even his deepest despair couldn't erase. I sat down in my living room with a glass of water and looked around at my house, at the books I'd never finished, reading the furniture that would need to be dealt with. The life I was about to abandon. Joe's expression shows that he's struggling with the weight of what he's hearing. As someone who's built his career on conversation, he understands that some stories are harder to hear than others, and that's when I heard it. Keanu says, she's voice shifting slightly. This sound from outside that I couldn't quite identify the change in his tone suggests they're approaching the pivot point of his story, the moment where darkness begins to give way to something else. I almost ignored it. Keanu admits I was so focused on my plan, so determined to follow through that I didn't want any distractions. But the sound kept happening, this rhythmic scraping noise that didn't fit with the usual nighttime sounds of the neighborhood. Joe leans forward slightly, sensing that this seemingly mundane detail is going to prove significant. I went to my front window and looked out. Keanu continues, and there was this kid, couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, skateboarding in the street in front of my house. The image seems incongruous with the heavy emotional territory they've been navigating. But something in Keanu's expression suggests its importance. It was past 1000 p.m. On a Friday night. Keanu says this kid should have been home asleep, getting ready for whatever kids do on Saturday mornings. But there he was, practicing the same trick over and over, falling down and getting back up, completely absorbed in what he was doing. Joe can see where this might be heading, but he remains silent, understanding that this story needs to unfold at its own pace. I watched him for probably 20 minutes. Keanu says, just this kid alone on a dark street working on perfecting something that probably seemed incredibly important to him in that moment. The parallel between the child's solitary persistence and Keanu's own solitary despair creates an unexpected resonance, and then he landed it. Keanu says, his voice gaining energy for the first time. Since he began this story, whatever trick he'd been working on, he finally got it right. And when he did, he threw his hands up in the air and let out this whoop of pure joy. Joe's expression shows that he's beginning to understand the significance of this moment. But here's the thing, Keanu continues, there was no one there to see it. No parents cheering, no friends to high-five, no audience at all, except for me watching from my window. He celebrated this achievement completely alone, for no one but himself. The weight of this observation settles over both men in that moment. Keanu witnessed someone finding joy and accomplishment in complete solitude, the exact opposite of his own experience of isolation, as nothing but darkness. I stood there watching this kid pack up his skateboard and head home, Keanu says, and I realized that he had just shown me something I had forgotten completely. Joe waits, understanding that this realization is the cornerstone of whatever saved Keanu's life that night. He showed me that life can have meaning, even when no one is watching. Keanu Seishi's voice, now thick with emotion, that accomplishment and joy and purpose don't require an audience, that sometimes the most important moments happen when you're completely alone. The simplicity and profundity of this insight creates a shift in the studio atmosphere. They're no longer descending into darkness, but beginning to climb towards something like hope. But as Keanu prepares to explain how this chance encounter with a child's solitary triumph changed the trajectory of his evening and possibly his life, it becomes clear that the story is more complex than a simple moment of inspiration. What happened next would test whether this glimpse of possibility could overcome months of accumulated despair and a meticulously planned surrender. The kid with the skateboard had unknowingly initiated a conversation between Keanu and life itself, but the outcome of that conversation was far from guaranteed. After the kid disappeared down the street, Keanu continues, his voice now carrying a different quality. Not the flat despair of earlier, but something more complex. I stood at that window for a long time, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. Joe can see that they've moved into different emotional territory now, away from the clinical description of suicidal planning towards something more introspective and uncertain. Part of me wanted to dismiss what I'd seen. Keanu admits to tell myself that Akild's moment of joy on a skateboard had nothing to do with my adult problems, my accumulated losses, my very adult reasons for wanting to exit this world. The honesty with which he describes his own resistance to hope is striking. This isn't someone who was instantly saved by a moment of inspiration, but someone genuinely wrestling with whether that inspiration had any relevance to his situation. But I couldn't shake the image, Keanu says. This kid alone on a dark street, finding genuine happiness in achieving something that mattered to no one but himself. It forced me to ask a question I'd been avoiding. Joe waits, sensing the importance of whatever question emerged from that moment. When was the last time I had felt joy that way? Keanu asks, pure uncomplicated satisfaction with something I had accomplished, regardless of whether anyone else noticed or cared. The question hangs in the air between them, and it's clear that this was a turning point, not because it provided easy answers, but because it opened up a line of inquiry Keanu hadn't been willing to pursue. I couldn't remember, Keanu admits. I literally could not think of a single recent moment when I had felt that kind of genuine satisfaction with anything in my life. Joe's expression shows understanding in a world where celebrity and public opinion defines success. The idea of finding meaning independent of external validation is both foreign and revolutionary. So I did something I hadn't done in months. Keanu says I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to really think about it. Not to plan my death or review my failures, but to honestly examine whether there was anything in my life that still gave me that kind of private satisfaction. The shift from planning destruction to seeking meaning represents a fundamental change in psychological direction, even if the outcome remained uncertain. It took a while, Keanu continues, but eventually I remembered something. There was this dog I'd been seeing on my morning walks, old golden retriever that belonged to an elderly woman. In my neighborhood, Joe nods encouragingly. Understanding that these details, however, small, represent threads of connection to life every morning for weeks. I'd walk past their house and this dog would be sitting in the front yard, tail wagging like he was waiting specifically for me to appear, Keanu says. And for the first time since he began this story, there's a hint of a smile in his voice. The woman, I later learned her name was Margaret, would wave from her porch and I'd wave back. No conversation, no exchange of personal information. Just this daily moment of acknowledgement between three beings going about their morning routines. The simplicity of this connection stands in stark contrast to the elaborate plan for self-destruction he'd been contemplating. I realized, Keanu says, that those few seconds each morning had become something I looked forward to. Not consciously, but somewhere in my brain. That dog's enthusiasm and Margaret's wave had created a small pocket of routine that felt good. Joe can see how this realization might have complicated Keanu's plans for that evening. Sitting there with my tea, Keanu continues, I started thinking about how my disappearance would affect that routine. The dog would sit there waiting for someone who would never come. Margaret would wonder what happened to the polite man who walked by. Each morning, the concern for these near strangers reveals the fundamental empathy that even his deepest depression couldn't completely eliminate. It wasn't enough to change my mind immediately. Keanu admits I wasn't suddenly overcome with reasons to live, but it introduced doubt into what had been a very certain decision. The honesty about the gradual nature of his shift away from suicide feels more authentic than dramatic moment of revelation narratives often heard in similar stories. I started thinking about other small connections I'd been taking for granted. Keanu says the barista at the coffee shop who always remembered how I liked my drink, a security guard at the studio who would nod and say, "Good morning, Mr. Reeves." Even though we'd never had a real conversation, Joe can see how this inventory of minimal but genuine human connections might have begun to complicate the narrative of isolation that had led to Keanu's dark planning. These weren't deep relationships, Keanu clarifies. They weren't going to solve my depression or erase my losses, but they were real, and they were mine. And ending my life would end them too, the way he frames it. Not as reasons to live, but as small casualties of his potential death, shows the complex psychology of someone climbing back from the edge. I sat there until about 2 a.m., Keanu says. Not because I had found peace or answers, but because I had found questions I hadn't been asking myself. As Keanu describes this internal struggle between the pull of ending his pain and the newly recognized value of small connections, it becomes clear that this wasn't a moment of dramatic salvation, but the beginning of a more complex negotiation with life itself. But something more would need to happen to tip the balance definitively toward choosing to continue living. Around 2:38 a.m. Keanu continues, his voice gaining strength as he moves toward what's clearly the pivotal moment of his story. I heard a car door slam outside, not unusual for LA, even at that hour, but something about the sound made me look out the window again. Joe can sense they're approaching the climax of this narrative, the moment that will explain how Keanu moved from methodical planning of his own death to sitting here decades later, sharing this story. There was a taxi in front of my house, Keanu says, and someone was getting out at first. I thought they had the wrong address. I wasn't expecting anyone. And it's not exactly a neighborhood where people just drop by. Unannounced in the middle of the night, the detail about the unexpected late-night visitor adds a layer of mystery to what's already an emotionally charged narrative. Then I saw who it was, Keanu says, and his voice carries a mixture of wonder and gratitude that suggests this moment changed everything. It was River. Joe's eyes widen in confusion. But River Phoenix died in not River Phoenix. Keanu clarifies quickly. River was what? I called my sister Kim's son, my nephew. He was 17 at the time, and he'd been struggling with some things himself. Depression, anxiety, typical teenage stuff that felt overwhelming to him. The clarification provides context, but also adds another layer of complexity to the story. River had been staying with Kim about 40 minutes away, Keanu explains, and apparently he'd been having a particularly difficult night. Couldn't sleep, feeling anxious and isolated the way teenagers do when everything feels insurmountable. Joe nods, beginning to understand how this unexpected arrival might connect to Keanu's own crisis. According to what he learned later, Keanu continues, River had been lying in bed around midnight, feeling overwhelmed by his own problems, when he suddenly had this intense urge to see me, not to talk about anything specific, not because of any emergency, just this overwhelming need to not be alone. The parallel between River's middle of the crisis and Keanu's own desperate state creates an almost uncanny symmetry. He didn't call first, Keanu says. He just took all the money. He had caught a taxi to my house and hoped I'd be awake. Joe's expression shows he's beginning to grasp the significance of this timing. A 17-year-old having a crisis of loneliness, arriving at the exact moment his uncle was contemplating ending his life. When I opened the door, Keanu says, his voice now thick with emotion, River looked terrible, exhausted, anxious, like he'd been crying. The first thing he said was, Uncle Keanu, I'm sorry for showing up like this, but I couldn't balloon anymore. The words carried devastating irony. Keanu was preparing to ensure he'd never have to be alone again, while his nephew was desperately seeking connection to escape his own isolation. I looked at this kid standing on my doorstep at 2:30 in the morning. Keanu continues, and I realized that everything I'd been thinking about my own loneliness and isolation was wrong. Joe leans forward, sensing they've reached the emotional core of the story. River needed me, Keanu says simply, not for anything dramatic or life-changing, just for the basic human comfort of not being alone with his thoughts, the simplicity of the need. Just presence, just companionship stands in stark contrast to the elaborate philosophical justifications Keanu had been constructing. For his planned suicide, we sat in my living room until dawn. Keanu says River told me about his anxiety, his fear that he wasn't smart enough or talented enough, his worry that he'd never figure out how to be an adult. The conversation Keanu describes sounds like a typical exchange between an uncle and nephew. But given the context, it becomes something much more significant. And as I listened to him, Keanu continues, I realized that every fear he was expressing, I had felt at 17 too. Every worry about not being enough, every anxiety about the future. I remembered feeling exactly the same way. Joe can see how this recognition might have shifted Keanu's perspective on his own struggles. I started telling him stories about my own teenage years. Keanu says about times I'd felt hopeless or lost or like I didn't fit anywhere. And I watched his face change as he realized he wasn't alone in feeling these things. The act of providing comfort and perspective to his nephew was simultaneously healing Keanu's own sense of disconnection and purposelessness. Around 500 a.m. Keanu continues. River fell asleep on my couch, and I sat there watching him sleep. This kid who had traveled across the city in the middle of the night because he trusted me enough to help him through a dark moment. The image of Keanu watching over his sleeping nephew provides a powerful counterpoint to the lonely vigil he'd been maintaining earlier that evening. That's when it hit me. Keanu says, his voice now strong and clear. I couldn't kill myself because people needed me. Not for my movies, or my career, or my public persona, but just for being Uncle Keanu, for being someone River could call at 2:30 a.m. As when the world felt too heavy. Joe's expression shows that he understands they've reached the moment of transformation, the point where Keanu shows life over death. I went into my bedroom and gathered up all the letters I'd written. Keanu says the goodbye notes, the explanations, the careful plans, and I burned them in my fireplace. While River slept, the act of destroying his suicide plans while his nephew slept safely on his couch creates a powerful image of choosing connection over isolation, responsibility over escape. When River woke up around noon, Keanu continues, he made him breakfast and told him he was welcome to stay as long as he needed. I didn't tell him what his timing had prevented, but I made sure he understood how grateful I was that he'd chosen to come to me. As Keanu describes this moment of choosing life through choosing to be needed by someone else, it becomes clear that his salvation came not through grand revelation, but through the simple recognition that his existence mattered to others in ways he hadn't fully understood. But what happened next would prove that this moment of grace was just the beginning of a longer journey back to wanting to live, rather than simply choosing not to die. River stayed with me for 3 weeks. Keanu continues, his voice filled with wonder. What started as a crisis visit became this extended period where we both learned what it means to take care of each other. The shift from surviving to truly living begins through responsibility for another person. For the first time in months, I had a reason to get up each morning that had nothing to do with career obligations. I had to make sure there was food in the house, that River felt supported, and heard Joe can see they've moved beyond immediate crisis into transformation territory. But the real breakthrough came on a Saturday morning about 2 weeks into River's stay. I was sitting in my kitchen planning our day when I realized something incredible. I was looking forward to things, small things, like making breakfast, maybe driving to the beach for the first time in months. The day felt like possibility. Instead of time to endure, the recognition of anticipation marks a profound shift from despair. River came into the kitchen and I asked what he wanted to do that day. He said, I want to do whatever makes you happy, Uncle Keanu. You've been so sad and I want to see you smile again. The teenager's direct acknowledgement creates mutual recognition and care. He started crying right there. Not from sadness, but from realizing I'd been so focused on my own pain that I hadn't noticed how it affected people who cared about me. River hugged me and said, it's okay to be sad, but you don't have to be sad alone. This 17-year-old was teaching Keanu something profound about grief and healing. That's when I told him about it Friday night, how close I'd come to ending everything, how his arrival had literally saved my life. He was quiet, then said, I'm glad. I listened to that feeling. Something told me you needed me too. The mutual rescue creates understanding of deep interconnectedness. That afternoon, Keanu chose openness over isolation, calling family and friends to share his struggle, finally planning to live instead of planning to die. Joe sits quietly processing everything. He's heard the studio feels charged with the weight of a story that will impact everyone who hears it. Keanu, Joe finally says, his voice softer than usual. I don't think I've ever heard anything quite like that. The timing, the synchronicity. It's almost like the universe intervened. Keanu nods thoughtfully. I've thought about that a lot, whether it was coincidence or something more, but I've come to believe it doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is that I was open to the intervention. When it came, the philosophical framework speaks to years of reflection and integration. Before that night, I thought, strength meant handling everything alone. Never being a burden. River taught me that real strength sometimes means letting people need you and admitting that you need them too. Joe recognizes the profound shift this represents since then. I've tried to be more aware of people around me who might be struggling in silence. You'd be surprised how often people are waiting for permission to not be okay. Keanu has transformed his trauma into a template for helping others. River is 25. Now works as a counselor for teenagers dealing with depression and anxiety. He says that night taught him that sometimes the person who needs help most is the one helping you. The ripple effect creates beautiful symmetry. I guess what I want people to understand, Keanu says, looking directly into the microphone, is that you matter more than you know. Your presence affects people in ways you can't imagine. If you're in a dark place right now, please know that the story isn't over. Yet Joe wipes his eyes. Thank you for sharing this. I think you probably saved lives today. If even one person decides to reach out instead of retreating, then it was worth reliving. That night, Keanu responds, because that's how it works. We save each other, usually without knowing we're doing